When you look at your own life and feel a quiet, unsettling estrangement, not from the world outside, but from something deeper, from yourself. You go through the motions of each day, the alarm, the coffee, the routines that string themselves together like beads on a wire you never chose to hold. And somewhere between the noise and the numbness, there's this low, persistent hum, a feeling you cannot quite name, that something inside you has been buried, that the person others see, the person even you see when you glance in the mirror, is not the whole story, that there is more of you, somewhere beneath the surface, waiting, suffocating, perhaps, patient, in the way that only neglected things can be. Carl Jung spent his entire life listening to that hum, not just in himself, though he listened there too, with a courage that bordered on recklessness, but in the hundreds of patients who came to him carrying the invisible weight of their unlived lives. He was one of the most penetrating psychologists who ever lived, a man who dared to look into the darkest corridors of the human mind and not flinch. And what he found there was not simply illness, not simply dysfunction. What he found was pattern, repetition, the same wounds wearing different faces, the same lies dressed up in different clothing, the same invisible chains wrapped around different wrists. And so he did what every great thinker eventually must do. He began to name things, because there is extraordinary power in naming something. When you can look at a force that has been quietly governing your life and say, "This is what you are," something shifts. The spell doesn't break entirely. Nothing so ancient and so deeply woven into us disappears with a single word, but it loosens. And sometimes, that loosening is everything. That tiny slip of light through the curtain is all we need to remember that the curtain was never the sky. Today, we are going to enter that territory together. We are going to look, with clear and unflinching eyes, at 5 of the most toxic things that Jung identified as suppressors of the human spirit, patterns of thought, of feeling, of relating, that keep us small, that keep us asleep, that prevent us from becoming who we were always meant to be. This is not a list of easy fixes. Jung had very little patience for easy fixes. He believed that transformation was earned through honesty, through pain willingly faced, through the slow and sometimes terrifying work of looking at yourself and refusing to look away. So if you are ready, not for comfort, but for clarity, then stay with me, because what we are about to explore has the power to change, not just how you think, but who you are. The first toxic thing Jung would ask you to abandon is something so familiar, so deeply woven into the fabric of modern life, that most of us have mistaken it for virtue. It is the persona, the mask. And before you think, "I don't wear a mask," let me ask you something gently, the way Jung might have asked it. Sitting across from you in that study in Küsnacht, the lake glittering just beyond the window, when was the last time you said something you truly believed, without calculating first how it would land? When was the last time you let someone see you? Not the version of you that is competent and agreeable and socially fluent, but the version that is confused, or afraid, or grieving something quietly. Jung wrote that the persona is not who we are. It is the costume we wear for the performance of social life. And this in itself is not pathological. We all need a persona. We cannot walk into a business meeting, or a first date, or a family gathering entirely unmediated. Social life requires a certain choreography, and the persona is part of that dance. The danger, and this is where Jung's warning cuts deep, comes when we forget that we are wearing a costume, when the mask fuses to the face, when you have worn the role of the good son, or the capable professional, or the easygoing friend for so long that you genuinely cannot find where the performance ends and the person begins. This is one of the most pervasive, quiet tragedies of our time. We live in an era that worships image. Every platform, every interaction, every moment is an opportunity for personal branding, for curating, for presenting the most palatable version of the self to the widest possible audience. And we have become so skilled at this, so practiced in the art of strategic self-presentation, that we have begun to lose access to our own interiority. We are strangers to ourselves, performing endlessly for an iron audience that includes, increasingly, no one more important than our own restless, approval-hungry ego. Jung saw this with devastating clarity in his patients. He would sit with men and women who had achieved everything the world said they should want: the career, the marriage, the reputation, the house, and who were nonetheless drowning in a sadness they couldn't explain. And when he looked beneath the presenting symptoms, beneath the depression or the anxiety or the vague sense of meaninglessness, he found the same thing again and again. A person who had constructed an elaborate and convincing persona, and then lost themselves inside it. The interior life had gone dark. The authentic self, what Jung would later call the self with a capital S, had been locked away, unfed, unacknowledged, slowly starving in the basement of the psyche. To abandon this toxin is not to become reckless with your vulnerability. It is not to perform rawness in the way that social media sometimes encourages, trading one mask for another, the mask of curated authenticity. It is something quieter and more demanding than that. It is to begin the slow, sometimes painful process of asking, "Who am I?" when no one is watching. What do I actually feel beneath what I am supposed to feel? What do I actually believe beneath what I have been taught to say? These questions are not comfortable, but they are the beginning of everything. They are the first thread you pull when you decide to find your way back to yourself. The second toxic pattern Jung identified is one that lives in shadow, quite literally in his framework. He called it the shadow. And unlike the persona, which faces outward, the shadow lives inward, in the part of the psyche we refuse to look at. It is the repository of everything we have disowned about ourselves, every impulse we deemed too shameful, too frightening, too ugly to belong to the person we are trying to be. The anger we were told was unacceptable, the neediness we learned to camouflage, the jealousy, the selfishness, the grief, the desire, all of it, packed away in the dark like boxes in an attic, accumulating dust and power in equal measure. Here is the paradox that Jung understood better than almost anyone. What we refuse to own in ourselves, we do not neutralize. We do not make it disappear by denying it. We simply make it unconscious. And unconscious material does not stay neatly in its box. It leaks. It seeps through the cracks. It expresses itself in ways we cannot see or control, precisely because we are not looking. The person who adamantly insists they are never angry finds themselves snapping at the people they love over small things. The person who believes they are entirely selfless discovers, in moments of unexpected honesty, a consuming self-centeredness they cannot explain. The person who has repressed their grief becomes numb to their joy, because we cannot selectively anesthetize ourselves. When we shut down one feeling, we mute the whole instrument. Jung said something that ought to stop us cold. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Read that again. Sit with it. Because how many of the patterns in your life that you have described as bad luck, as circumstance, as just the way things are, how many of those are, in reality, the shadow pulling the strings from beneath the stage? How many of the conflicts in your relationships are you creating without knowing it? Because something unacknowledged in you keeps choosing the same dynamics, keeps responding in the same unconscious way, keeps attracting or creating the same painful outcomes. To work with the shadow is one of the most courageous acts a human being can undertake. It requires you to look at the parts of yourself you have spent years constructing elaborate defenses against. It requires a kind of radical self-honesty that our culture rarely encourages, and our egos will resist with tremendous force, because the ego does not want to know about the shadow. The ego has a very tidy story about who you are and why you do the things you do, and the shadow is full of evidence that complicates that story considerably. But here is what Jung found, and what every person who has done this work, in therapy or in solitude or in the long honesty of genuine relationship, tends to discover. The shadow is not only darkness. Yes, it contains what we have deemed unacceptable, but it also contains gold. It holds the creative impulse that was shamed into silence, the passion that was told it was too much, the authentic self that was too wild, too feeling, too real for the environments that shaped us. When you go into the shadow, not to punish yourself but to understand yourself, you do not only find what you feared, you find what you lost. You find energy that has been tied up in suppression, suddenly available. You find depth you didn't know you had, and a compassion for yourself and for others that only comes from having looked honestly at what it means to be human. The third toxic thing that Jung would urge you to release is something that on the surface looks like love. It looks like devotion, like closeness, like loyalty. But beneath the warmth, it carries a hidden blade. And that is the toxic form of what Jung identified as enmeshment, the failure to individuate, the surrender of the self into another person or into a collective identity at the expense of one's own becoming. Jung called the process of becoming a whole, authentic individual, individuation. It was for him not merely a psychological process but a spiritual one. The fundamental purpose of a human life, to individuate, is to become more and more fully the unique person you are, not the person your parents needed you to be, not the person your culture scripted you to play, not the reflection your partner requires to feel secure. Your own person, with your own values, your own voice, your own relationship to truth. And the obstacle to this process, one of the most powerful and most tender obstacles, is the pull of the psyche to merge, to dissolve, to give up the harder work of being an individual in exchange for the comfort of belonging. This pattern shows up in many forms. It shows up in the person who has spent their entire adult life living out the unlived dreams of a parent, who became the doctor or the lawyer or the responsible one, not because those roles were truly theirs, but because the cost of disappointing that parent felt unbearable. And over time, the borrowed life became the only life they knew. It shows up in the romantic relationship where two people have fused so completely that neither can say where one ends and the other begins, where love has quietly become a system of mutual dependency, where the unspoken contract is, you do not grow in ways that make me feel left behind, and I will do the same for you. It shows up in the person who cannot exist outside their group, their political tribe, their religious community, their social circle, because the group's identity has become the scaffolding for a self that never quite developed its own structure. Jung was not cold about this. He understood the deep human hunger for belonging, the terror of aloneness, the genuine love that often underlies even the most enmeshed of bonds. But he was clear, if the price of belonging is the abandonment of the self, then what you are buying is not love, it is disappearance, and a life spent disappearing into others, however warmly received, however socially praised, is not a life that was fully lived. It is, to us, in the deepest sense, a tragedy. The quiet tragedy of the person who reached the end of their days and realized, with a grief that had nowhere to go, that they had never quite arrived at their own life. To step back from enmeshment is not to stop loving. It is not to become cold or self-absorbed or indifferent to the people who matter to you. It is to love from a place of wholeness rather than from a place of need. It is to be present to others without losing the thread back to yourself. And this, in Jung's view, and in the view of every psychologist and philosopher who has thought carefully about human flourishing, is the only foundation from which genuine intimacy is possible. You cannot truly see another person if you have dissolved into them. You cannot truly give to another if you have nothing left that is yours. The fourth toxic pattern is subtler than the others, and in some ways more dangerous precisely because of its subtlety. Jung identified it in various forms throughout his work, but it can be named simply as the refusal of suffering, the compulsive turning away from pain, the addiction to avoidance, the cultural and psychological conspiracy that tells us that discomfort is the enemy, and that the goal of a well-lived life is the elimination of all that hurts. We live in a civilization that has become extraordinarily sophisticated in the art of avoidance. There are more ways to not feel things today than at any previous moment in human history. The phone in your pocket is, among other things, a precision instrument for escaping the present moment, for flooding the nervous system with stimulation just before the silence gets deep enough to become uncomfortable. We drink, and we scroll, and we work ourselves to exhaustion, and we fill every quiet space with noise, not because we are lazy or weak, but because the alternative, sitting with what we actually feel, is something we were never really taught to do, and something our culture has pathologized into irrelevance. Jung had a very different relationship to suffering than most. He did not romanticize it. He was too precise a thinker for that. He did not believe that pain was good in itself, or that one should seek it out for its own sake. But he observed, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades watching the human psyche at work, that the attempt to flee from psychological pain almost always makes it worse, that what we run from, we carry with us, that the wound we refuse to acknowledge does not heal. It festers. It shapes our behavior from beneath the surface of consciousness. It distorts our perception, narrows our world, makes us reactive and rigid and afraid in ways we cannot see because we are so busy not seeing. He also observed something else, something more surprising and more hopeful, that suffering, when it is met with consciousness, when it is turned toward rather than fled from has the capacity to be one of the most powerful forces for transformation in human life. That the descent into darkness, the willingness to be broken open by what is painful, is often the precise mechanism through which the psyche reorganizes itself at a higher level. That the person who comes out the other side of a genuine confrontation with their own pain, not the performance of pain, not the wallowing in victimhood, but the clear-eyed meeting of what is real and what hurts, is a different person, a deeper person, a person with a greater capacity for compassion, for meaning, for genuine joy. Because here is something that gets lost in the relentless pursuit of happiness that characterizes so much of contemporary life. Joy and pain are not opposites in the way we have been told. They are, in the deepest sense, made of the same fabric. The person who has never been genuinely sad cannot be genuinely joyful. The person who has refused to feel their fear cannot know what courage actually is. The person who has never sat with grief has never fully loved. Emotional depth is not available on a menu where you select the pleasant items and leave the rest. It comes whole, or it barely comes at all. And the avoidance of suffering, the relentless, exhausting, ultimately futile project of keeping the darkness out, purchases a kind of safety that is really just a smaller, dimmer life. To abandon this toxin is to make a different agreement with your own experience. It is to say, I will not always run. I will sometimes sit with what is hard. I will let myself be moved by what is real, even when what is real is painful. This is not masochism. It is not weakness. It is, in fact, one of the most radically courageous things a human being can do in a world that has industrialized avoidance and sold it back to us as wellness. The fifth and final toxic pattern is, in many ways, the deepest. It is the one that underlies all the others, the ground from which they grow. Jung pointed to it in different ways throughout his career, but it can be understood as the worship of certainty, the compulsive need to know, to have answers, to stand on solid ground at all times, to avoid at any cost the vertiginous experience of not knowing. It is the ego's insistence on being right, on having a map for every territory, on never having to face the abyss of genuine uncertainty with open hands. We live in an age of unprecedented information, and paradoxically, an age of profound psychological fragility in the face of ambiguity. We have access to more data than any previous generation, and yet the capacity to sit comfortably with not knowing seems rarer than ever. We need our identities to be clear and legible. Politically, spiritually, personally, we need our beliefs to be firm, our worldviews to be coherent, our sense of who we are and what life means to be settled and secure. And when that security is threatened by a new idea, by a challenging experience, by the encounter with someone whose inner world is genuinely different from our own, the reflex is to reject, to dismiss, to double down, to find whatever information confirms the map we already have, rather than to consider that the territory might be larger and stranger than we imagined. Jung understood this because he had faced his own abyss of uncertainty and documented it with extraordinary honesty in what would later become the Red Book, his private record of the years when he descended into the depths of his own unconscious and could not always be sure he would return. He had stared into the face of genuine not knowing and found, on the other side of it, not annihilation, but a richer, stranger, more capacious understanding of what it means to be alive and conscious. He had learned, in the most visceral possible way, that the self that can be shaken is not the deepest self, that beneath the ego's need for certainty is something more stable, more resilient, more worthy of trust. He also understood that the worship of certainty is, in a profound sense, the enemy of growth, because to grow is always to move into unfamiliar territory. It is always to stand, for some period of time, in the space between who you were and who you are becoming, a space that is, by definition, uncertain. The caterpillar does not know it is becoming a butterfly. In the middle of the process, inside the chrysalis, nothing is formed, and everything is possible, and nothing is safe. And if the caterpillar could think, if it could panic at the dissolution of everything it had been, it might find a way to stop the process, to stay half-transformed, rigid and incomplete, terrified of what the not knowing might mean. To release the worship of certainty is not to embrace nihilism. It is not to say that nothing is knowable, or that all truths are equally valid, or that we should abandon the pursuit of understanding. It is something more nuanced and more demanding. It is to hold your beliefs with rigor and without rigidity, to know what you know, and to remain genuinely open to knowing more, to be willing, when the evidence of your own lived experience demands it, to revise the map, to meet mystery not with terror, but with the kind of reverent curiosity that Jung himself embodied, the willingness to stand at the edge of what is known and lean forward, rather than back. These 5 toxic patterns, the rigid persona, the unexamined shadow, the enmeshment that swallows the self, the compulsive flight from suffering, and the worship of certainty, are not separate problems. They are, at their root, expressions of the same fundamental fear, the fear of being fully and honestly human, the fear of the depth and the darkness and the wildness and the uncertainty that are woven into the very nature of consciousness, the fear, ultimately, of encountering yourself. Jung spent his life arguing, through his theories, his clinical work, his own unflinching self-examination, that this encounter is not optional, that we can delay it, that we can construct lives of enormous complexity and apparent success specifically designed to make it unnecessary, but that the psyche has its own wisdom, its own insistence, its own way of bringing to the surface what we have buried, and the longer we wait, the more the buried material accumulates weight and pressure until the thing we were most afraid to face becomes the thing we cannot avoid. But here is the other side of that truth, the side that Jung never lost sight of, even in his darkest explorations. The encounter with yourself is not only frightening, it is, ultimately, the greatest adventure available to a human being. To find, beneath the masks and the shadows, and the borrowed identities and the avoidances, a self that is genuine and vital and yours. To make contact with what is most alive in you is an experience that no external achievement can replicate. It is the difference between a life that was performed and a life that was lived. Jung wrote, near the end of his long life, that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not who you were supposed to be, not who fear made you, not the accumulated result of every compromise with authenticity, but the person who was there at the beginning, before the world had its say, before the persona was built, and the shadow was filled, and the self was lent out, and the pain was avoided, and the certainty was clutched. That person is still there. Whatever you have covered them with, they have not disappeared. They are the hum beneath the noise, the ache beneath the numbness, the dream you keep almost remembering when you wake up in the early hours and the world has gone quiet enough to tell you the truth. The question Jung asks you, the question that echoes through every page of his work, every session with every patient, every midnight he spent in that tower on the lake, writing the things he could not say elsewhere, is not whether you are broken. It is whether you are brave enough to find out who you really are, whether you are willing to do the slow, uncomfortable, luminous work of coming home to yourself. And if you are, even a little, even imperfectly, even with fear still in your chest, then you have already taken the first step. And the first step, as every great journey teaches us, is the one that changes everything.